Now, Facebook's been accused by the government of making heavy-handed threats to lock Australian media out of its platforms. Now, Facebook has today warned it will ban news on its platform if the ACCC powers forcing it to compensate media companies for publishing their stories comes into effect. In a statement, Facebook said, assuming this draft becomes law, we'll reluctantly stop allowing publishers and people in Australia from sharing local and international news on Facebook and Instagram. This is not our first choice, it is our last. Let's get some reaction from the Communications Minister, Paul Fletcher. Did you expect the tech giant to go straight to attempted coercion in this space?
Well, we have from time to time seen heavy-handed threats from global tech companies when it comes to public policy issues in Australia and indeed in other countries. But look, we've got a well-established process underway. It began with the ACCC's digital platforms inquiry, which began at the end of 2017. They've done very detailed work. They brought recommendations to government. One of those recommendations was that there ought to be a code governing the negotiations between Australian news media businesses and the digital platforms, where the digital platforms are using content generated and paid for by Australian news media businesses. So we're working through a careful, thorough process here. Everybody gets the chance to put their views to government. Facebook, indeed, Google and others have had that chance. The ACCC's been consulting now for a month on the draft of the code which it issued, and it will now consider the views that have been put to it before it gives its final advice to government.
There's a bit of irony in this statement from Facebook where it talks about vibrant media and the best journalism. I mean, Facebook itself has not covered itself in glory in recent years in terms of its editing practices and various other elements. So the fact that it's now, lecturing this sector and the government in terms of its response, it's a bit rich, isn't it?
Well, there's a public policy interest in having a vigorous news media. It's important in a liberal democracy, and certainly the Australian government wants to see a vigorous media. So it's a media policy issue. It's also a competition policy issue, which is why we've asked our competition regulator, the ACCC, to take the lead on this issue, including competition for advertising. Let's remember that the Google and Facebook business model is to attract people to their sites. They do it very successfully. Over 17 million Australians use Facebook every month, over 19 million use Google. And then those eyeballs, they're able to monetise with advertising revenue. But if they're using content generated and paid for by Australian news media businesses to attract those eyeballs to the sites, then there ought to be a commercial negotiation. As the ACCC says, Google and Facebook are unavoidable business partners for Australian news media businesses. Yeah, indeed they are. And of course, disclosure, I think our viewers would be well aware, but News Corporation owns Sky News and like many other major news companies, has been lobbying for action in this space where there should be payment for journalism provided. But it's interesting, Campbell Brown, Facebook's head of global news on NBC, seemed to indicate that she's not worried about any ripple effects, that, quote, I think Australia is an outlier, unquote. How do you react to that? Well, the Australian government is charged with making policy for Australia. Obviously, we're dealing with global giants. And that has been a challenge that governments everywhere have faced for the last 20 years in a range of areas, whether it's GST or whether indeed it's cyberbullying. We have successfully introduced laws and required businesses operating in Australia to comply with those laws. So we'll confine ourselves to what's needed in Australia and what's going to work in Australia. But it's interesting they're saying that they're not worried about the ripple effects, yet they're throwing their weight around like, well, in a big way in terms of that statement today, like it suggests that they would be or are worried about the ripple effects. Well, it certainly looks like they are. Look, I won't be a commentator on what Facebook is saying corporately. Facebook has every opportunity to meet with me, meet with the Treasurer, and indeed they've done that. They've had every opportunity to put submissions. They'll have a continuing opportunity, as will all stakeholders, because we're going through a careful, proper public policy process. That's why we put out a draft. Then comments come in, then a final. So, look... so what about the language that Google and Facebook have been using this,
you know, these threats, the heavy-handed threats. What do you say to them about that, given the process?
What I'd say is we've got a proper process. Put your arguments to us, make your submissions. We're happy to hear your views. We'll weigh it up against all of the issues that need to be weighed up here, but we've got a clear direction. We won't be dissuaded from that because of particular threats.
And do you believe that you will be able to come up with a compromise, a code that keeps everyone happy?
Well, look, we've charged our competition regulator with this important piece of work. Rod Sims, chair of the ACCC, has been leading the work. His advice to government has been, you know, that this is the approach that should be pursued. He's put out a draft. He'll come to us in due course with the final form of his advice, and we'll take that forward consistent with what we've said. We've said there needs to be a mandatory code, but of course, part of the process of having a draft code is so that you can receive comments from all stakeholders and weigh those up.
Minister, I appreciate your time as always. Thanks.